Hi there, my name is Newo, and I'm a techno artist from Los Angeles. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on my track Cathode, featuring Luke Lethal on my latest release Techno Mixtape 2. And real quick, I want to give a major shout out to Lucas. He is a techno artist based out of Florida. He used to go by Dr. Boom, and his new alias is Luke Lethal, which is, if I believe correctly, more focused on techno. And he was one of the first people really to ever believe in my music. For that, I'm forever grateful. Fantastic DJ, fantastic producer, fantastic person overall. So give him a follow, check out his stuff, check out some of our previous collabs. And let's go ahead and dive into this. So for sake of example, I'm going to play a little bit of the master. As you can see, this is a very stripped down record, very intentionally minimal, and heavily influenced by both minimal techno, a little bit of warehouse techno, but electro house. And influenced by electro house, not melodically. I'm very into the grooves that come out of electro house drums, and especially those sort of glitchy synths. So I wanted to incorporate that sort of like glitchiness and sort of bounciness into something almost like a DJ tool, something that I could layer and play in a set, you know. So when I break this track down, you might be surprised how simple it is, but my approach moving forward with music is less is more, and I luckily just so happen to focus on minimal techno, so I guess that works. But let's go ahead and make this inactive. And I'm just going to go ahead and solo all of the drums because the drums on this are very straightforward, so I won't spend too much time breaking that down because there's not, as you can see, there's not even that many plugins going on. It's really just very intentional sound choices and intentional with like the spacing on that. So the tom and the sub, play off each other. The hi-hats kind of play off each other, the vocals, so on and so forth. And these drums are something that I made, and then because this track is a collaboration, I sent them to Lucas to kind of be like, okay, here's a foundation. Let's try and expand upon that. So let me go ahead and show you what we're working with. So they don't really change too much. The last part of the record, they change a little more, and that is to signal that there's a mix out happening, but also just to provide a little bit of variation versus other parts of the record. So let me just briefly go ahead and walk you through like the kick. I mean, the kick, I won't even spend too much time on it because it's really simple. It's just a very intentional sample choice. I spent a lot of time going through and seeing which versions of kicks that I had sounded good. And the only other thing on the kick was I went through, and Pro Tools has a cool feature, which is the clip gain line, and you can automate that. So I made sure to have the kick be at an eighth note, and I kind of brought up the last part of it to maintain the same volume. And those sort of punchy kicks that are around an eighth note for techno work extremely well because they give your sub and your bass enough room to really breathe. And with the kick, I really just applied a little bit of distortion. And then when I took it to the studio, that was where I really did all the processing with like a distressor, a little bit of analog distortion, obviously the console EQ, and then on the final, like on the master compressor, so to speak, I had the overstayer, and that just kind of glued things together nicely. So moving on to the sub. The sub is something that I printed, and then once I printed it, I applied the Verify plugin to it. And again, this is the same technique that I use where I'll just start with a sine wave and just keep it in mathematically communicating with the kick, so it's at the same frequency and that the harmonics are all talking to each other and whatnot. But the Verify just gave it that sort of rolling sound. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the sub and the tom kind of play off each other. So the tom is coming in between. One other quick note on the kick is, like, a lot of times in my records, I'll just go through and mute like one of the kick drums or double up one of the kick drums just to provide a little more variation in the sound. Now the clap was 2 samples, and one of them had more of like a pre-clap going on, and the other one had the thicker part of the clap. So I just brought those together with a little bit of transient shaping, put it in mono with the imager, which I really could have just split it into mono on a channel, but whatever. And then just taking off a little bit of the top, but I don't really know how necessary that was, to be honest with you. Probably could have gotten away without doing it. The secondary clap is a little bit more of just a distorted clap, and it kind of sits in the background a little bit. It's not as forward as that main clap. Another way the main clap becomes more forward in the mix is with this little reverse effect going on. And going back to that electro house influence, that's something that is very common in electro house, is to have that sweeping in effect, but right before the clap. The hi-hats, very simple, just a little bit of my go-to distortion, some EQ and some compression going on, and then some sidechain. Oh, actually not some sidechain. So this was actually just to contain it a little bit. And then that has like a secondary hat, and this hat I believe comes from Logic. Sometimes I'll pull sounds from the Logic drum kits and import them as audio files into Pro Tools. Partially because I don't really like doing my drums in MIDI. I like being able to see everything. The 16th hat, I believe that's the one that's sidechained. And so that I actually froze because when I placed it on the console, sometimes the studio doesn't have the same plugins that I have. So that's a feature I really enjoy about Pro Tools, is you can still transfer your session no problem. Other than that, there's just like a little snare going on, which is sending into, it's like a reverb, kind of like a slapback delay almost. And it just creates that sort of stereo contrast because the drums are very mono. So it makes it stand out a little more. From there, this vocal I had added. Fucked up. And then Lucas added this one. And so what Lucas added once I gave him those drums was this 303. And this is how that sounds. And I really liked it. I actually, when I sent it to him, I was pleasantly surprised because I actually wasn't expecting him to put a 303 on it, but I really enjoyed how it sounded. And then I started thinking, like, okay, he sent me this 303, but how can I make that not just a 303 and still be a collaboration? So what I did is I actually took a tiny segment of it, and then I copied it and moved it here into another channel, and I just played it over and over and over and over and over and over for the entire length of the track, and it just turns into that black bar. And let's kind of go ahead and see how that initial 303 turned into what it is. Because the synthesizer in the record, it's got that like really bit crushed sound, but it still kind of sounds acid in a way. So what I did is I took that little sample and I pitched it down an octave using Elastic Audio in Pro Tools. And then from there, I'll take all the plugins off. So what that ended up sounding like was this. And I mean, it's a cool sound, but it's not a lead sound, right? It's kind of, it needs more. So I started thinking like, well, usually I make my lead sounds from just a sine wave with intentional plug-in, automation and layering and whatnot. And I figured, why not just apply that same technique to the sample I have from Lucas? So I added some distortion, my go-to distortion, and then the vintage filter is where I had that light bulb go off in my head moment, and you'll hear why. The only thing is it darkened it quite a bit. And so what that's doing is there's an LFO on that filter. And so to bring that further just up in the mix, I threw some distortion on it. And I messed around with the drive setting because I wanted it to bite just a little bit. And you can hear it, it bites, but not the whole entire time. So then from there, just very intentional, cutting off of some of the low frequencies. Does Pro Tools want to cooperate today? Yes, it does. Thank you. Okay, so that's not really doing too much. It's just a little bit of compression and EQ. From there, I have the lo-fi, and this is like a bit crusher. It's a stock Pro Tools plugin. So that really built it up quite a bit. And as you can see too, there's quite a few parameters being automated. So I'll continue to expand upon that. From there, just some sidechain compression, which is just the kick drum sending into a bus. Another Nova. Yeah, so Pro Tools doesn't always want to cooperate. It's an older version of Pro Tools, and my computer is not exactly brand new either. But anyways, let's keep going. So the Kramer, this is something where I really didn't do too much. I just boosted a little bit of 250 and a little bit of 700 just to thicken it a little bit. And then from there, just some intentional cuts with the EQ. Partially because I knew that some of these harmonics would fill back in later with the analog mixing, so I wasn't too concerned. So what I did is, like, let's try and find some areas where there's a lot of automation. Yeah, so like here. So kind of, I was experimenting. Once I got that core groove going, I was like, well, let's try and add some variation and automate at certain parts, like whether if the beat cuts out or like to signal that there's a little, like here, a little breakdown, just to keep it moving. And I really had a lot of fun doing that. And I was actually really surprised that it all just came from a small segment of that initial 303. So now let's make that inactive. That should free up some computer space too. So then I printed it. And I pretty much always print my sounds when I'm doing this sort of sound design. Because it partially for CPU, but partially just so I can lock in an idea and not have to worry about it too much. Because sometimes I'll experiment too much on an idea and then I'll lose what I had at one point because I went too far down the rabbit hole. So I think as producers, it's very important to know, almost like to know when to stop with sound design, because you can very easily lose a whole groove that you had just because you messed up some parameters and you can't get that patch back, or you can't get that, session file back or something. So I'm a big supporter of like committing your tracks and rendering things out, printing things out. And I further developed on that sound by, like, on the breakdown, there's some stereo, left, right going on. So it kind of starts out going slow, and then as it gets closer to the drop, it gets more and more fast left and right kind of thing. Max bass was something I did based off of the fundamental to just fill in and kind of make it sound thicker than it actually is. You know, and then just taking out some little peaks on the EQ just to make it a little smoother. And then the imaging, this is again where the, you know, where the automation comes in. But let's talk about this wave folder. So this is a free plugin by Melda Production, and it's a type of distortion that gets different tones than the ones that I have in Pro Tools. And it only comes in one spot. But let's go ahead and hear that. So what I do on that is, like, I was literally just scrolling through presets on it. And then I started to tweak one that I really liked and just kept it in there. And yeah, that's the main part of the track. I mean, the track, if you mute that synthesizer, it's really just drums. So other than that, like, there's a little crash effect. And that was something that Lucas added. And then on top of that, there were a few sounds that Lucas gave me as well that I ended up not using. But, you know, with collaborations, it's always tricky because, like, I do sometimes prefer to physically be in the room together. And I'm sure that if Lucas and I were in the room together working on it, we might have ended up with a slightly different sound. But regardless, I mean, that is one cool thing about the internet is you can still work with people even if you met them, you know, either a while ago or just across the country or something like that. So other than that, the 303 or that version of the 303 is going into some stereo width. It's just a little bit of the wider plugin. And then, oh yeah, I believe, so let's see. There's some automation on that too. And then there's a little bit of a delay, which again is like that sort of slapback delay. And then the 303 is also going into just a little bit of distortion with a little more width. And you'll see, you know, it's a little lower in volume. Now, Black Hole is one of my reverbs of choice. I have a couple different reverbs that I'll use at different times, but one thing I like about it is you can automate the size. So for example, let's just double check here. Yeah, so you can automate the size. Oh, you know what? Hold on. I gotta mute that original 303. So you hear that sort of like sweeping in effect. And it's easy to overdo, but it also can create some cool sounds if you don't do it as fast. Like going into the mix out, it sounds like this. And actually, you know what? I should correct myself. I'm automating the freeze on that. But again, if you know, with Black Hole, if you automate the freeze, it actually is cool to like side chain it because then it turns into almost like an atmospheric type of effect. But what I was initially talking about was this. So you hear that sort of like background sweep kind of noise, but it's not as intense as that shorter version of it. And then on top of that, just another little reverb that some of the effects are sending into. And that's really the record. Now, the VIP of this is something that was more of a solo track because I took the same concept as that 303. I just basically tried to recreate it, and I added a few different touches to it. But on the VIP, the drums are basically exactly the same. And if you would like to see a tutorial on the VIP, just let me know. I can always do that. But I really appreciate everyone checking out today's tutorial. Let me know if there's any questions you have on this. And if there's anything else you would like to see me expand upon relating to either this record, Techno Mixtape 2, or any of my other material. So make sure to check me out on Twitter at tapnewo, TAPNEWO, and Instagram tapnewotechno. And definitely check out Luke Lethal as well. Have a great day. Thank you.